Northwest side of Chicago, September 1986. A man is running from a bingo hall, and he is losing. He has just killed his own best friend in the doorway, in front of dozens of people, and not one of them will ever be able to say what he looked like. Somewhere in that run, he drops a glove. He does not go back for it. That glove goes into a paper bag. The bag goes into an evidence room, and there it sits, while the man who dropped it goes home and keeps working and gets older and watches the case go cold, the way cases like this always went cold in Chicago. It sits there for 20 years. The man's name is Third Calabrese. He is a made member of the Chicago outfit, which is not a thing you say about many people because the Chicago outfit did not make many. And the friend he has just killed in that doorway is a man named John Fecarotta, who he had known for most of his adult life, and who had been sent to help him with a bum, and who had figured out on the way there that the job was him. Here's the question this video answers. How does an organization that beat the federal government for 70 years, that survived Capone, survived Prohibition, survived the Kennedys, survived every wiretap and every task force anybody ever pointed at it, how does that organization finally come apart? Not slowly. In one courtroom, in one summer. The answer has two halves, and neither one is what you would guess. It is not a wiretap. It is not a boss who flipped. It is a piece of cloth that had to wait for science to catch up with it. And it is a son who agreed to wear a recording device to a prison yard so his father would talk to him about murders. Stay with me, because the second half is the part nobody was ready for. Start with why John Fecarotta had to die, because it explains the whole shape of what follows. In June of 1986, two brothers named Tony and Michael Spilatro disappeared. Tony was the outfit's man in Las Vegas, the one you have seen played by an actor. And by that summer, he had become a problem his own organization had decided to solve. They were killed and they were buried, and the burial was botched, badly enough that the bodies turned up in an Indiana cornfield within days, and every newspaper in America had the story. We have told that story on this channel already, and it is not this one. What matters here is only this. Somebody had to answer for the burial, and the man the outfit decided would answer for it was John Fecarotta. So in September, Fecarotta was told there was a job, a bomb at a dentist's office, a matter of debt collection. He and Third Calabrese would do it together. They drove there in the dark with the package between them, and somewhere on that drive, Fecarotta stopped believing the story. There was an argument. There was a struggle in the car. A gun went off in the confusion. And in that confusion, Calabrese put a bullet through his own arm. Fecarotta got out and ran. Calabrese went after him and caught him in the entryway of a bingo hall on Belmont Avenue and shot him there in a doorway in a building full of people. And then he ran, bleeding into the dark, and dropped a glove. Now hold two facts side by side because everything in this story lives in the space between them. Fact one, dozens of people were inside that hall. Police interviewed them. Nobody could describe the shooter. That is not because Chicago was full of cowards. That is because everybody in that neighborhood understood exactly what kind of thing they had just seen and what happened to people who described it. Fact two, there was blood on that glove, and it was not John Fecarotta's. In 1986, that second fact was worth almost nothing. The science to do anything with it in a courtroom did not exist yet in any usable form. So the glove was bagged and logged and put on a shelf, and the case joined the long list of Chicago murders that everyone in the neighborhood could explain and no prosecutor could charge. The man who ordered those gloves cut into pieces afterward, and by one account from a man who sat through the later trial, somebody did order exactly that, never learned that one of them had already been left behind. 20 years is a long time. Let me tell you what happens in it. Third Calabrese has an older brother, Frank Calabrese Sr., and Frank runs a crew on the south side of Chicago that makes its money the oldest way there is, lending it and then collecting it. Frank is very good at collecting, and the way he was good at it is worth one example, because it tells you what kind of man the government was eventually going to put in a courtroom. There was a developer who owed money. Nobody broke his legs. Instead, for months, things simply arrived. At his home, at his car, where his family would see them. Nothing that required a translation. Nothing that could be charged as a crime either. The developer eventually paid $2 million in cash, and then, according to testimony, thanked the man who had spent those months arranging his life that way. That is the business, not violence exactly. Violence held just close enough that you organize your own surrender and feel grateful about it. By the late 1990s, the two brothers are both in federal prison on a racketeering case, which in the outfit is not a catastrophe. It is closer to an occupational cost. You do your years, you keep your mouth shut, and the organization is there when you come out. And in that same federal prison in Michigan, there is a Third Calabrese. Frank Calabrese Jr. is doing his own time on his father's case for his father's business, because that is what the family did, and he had never really been offered another option. He is in his 30s. He has spent his entire life inside this, and he has watched what it did to his mother and to his brothers and to him. And at some point in those years, sitting in that prison, Frank Jr. does something that has no precedent in the history of the Chicago outfit. He writes a letter to the FBI, not to make a deal for himself. He asked for nothing. The letter said, in effect, my father is going to get out, and when he gets out, he is going to go back to work, and people are going to down, and I would like to help you stop him. The agents who got that letter had a hard time believing it. Sons of made men did not write letters like that, so they tested him the way you test anybody, and Frank Jr. passed the test, and then he made an offer that went further than anything they had asked for. He said he would wear a wire on his father in the prison yard every day for as long as it took. Understand the physical situation. This is not a hidden microphone in a restaurant where you can leave if it gets bad. This is a federal prison yard. The two of them walk laps together, a father and a son, the way they had walked for years, and the son is carrying a device. And if the device is found, if a guard is careless, if it makes a sound, if the wrong person notices the wrong thing, there is no exit. There is no car waiting. He is locked in a building with the people he is recording. He did it for months, and his father talked. That is the part that still does not entirely make sense, and Frank Jr. has said as much himself. His father talked because he was talking to his son. He explained things. He named things. He described work he had done, decades of it, in the flat, practical voice of a man explaining a trade to the next generation, because that is exactly what he thought he was doing. Hours of it went into evidence. Now that is a devastating thing to have. But sit with what it actually was, legally. One grown man in a prison yard telling stories to another, powerful, damning, and not the same thing as proof of a specific murder on a specific night. To take apart an organization, prosecutors needed something that pointed at a body. If cases that everybody knows about and nobody can prove are the kind of history you want, subscribe. This channel is mostly built out of them. Which brings us back to the shelf. In the early 2000s, the FBI did something methodical and unglamorous. They went around the federal prison system and took DNA samples from members of the Chicago outfit, men who were already inside, already convicted, already, as far as anyone was concerned, finished business. And then they went back to the old evidence. The blood on the glove from the bingo hall doorway, the one nobody had been able to do anything with in 1986, matched Nicholas Calabrese. There was one more piece, and it is the detail that makes the whole thing click. Remember the struggle in the car, the gun going off, the bullet through his own arm. Investigators went to a judge and got an order to x-ray his shoulder. A former head of organized crime for the Chicago FBI office described what came back with a phrase I can't improve on. That x-ray lit up like a Christmas tree. 20 years earlier, a man had run through the dark and dropped a glove and taken a wound with him. Both of those things were still there. One in a paper bag, one in his own body. Nicholas Calabrese was looking at the rest of his life for a murder he could not talk his way out of. And so he did the thing the Chicago outfit had almost never produced in its entire history. He agreed to testify against it. In April of 2005, the government brought an indictment, 14 defendants, 18 unsolved murders, some of them older than the agents working the case. By the time it reached a courtroom in the summer of 2007, that 14 had come down to 5. Some had pleaded, 2 had died before trial. One was found too sick to stand. 5 men were left in a federal courtroom in the Dirksen building in downtown Chicago in front of Judge James Zagel, Joey Lombardo, James Marcello, Frank Calabrese Sr., Paul Shiro, Anthony Doyle. The youngest of them was past 60. They were, between them, most of what was left of the Chicago outfit's leadership. And the government's case was built on a brother and a son. The trial ran 11 weeks. Nicholas Calabrese sat in the witness chair and described in detail work he had personally done and who else had been in the room. Frank Jr.'s recordings played in open court, and the jury listened to a man explain his life's work to his own child. All 5 were convicted of racketeering conspiracy. There is a detail from that day that says more than the verdict does. Of the 5, only one had been free during the trial, out on bond, going home at night. That was Anthony Doyle. When the verdict came in, his bond was revoked in the courtroom, and he was taken into custody from where he sat. The organization that had spent 70 years being impossible to hold on to was, that afternoon, in custody, once in one room. And then there was the matter of what to do with Nicholas Calabrese. He had admitted to 14 murders, 14. He had also given the government roughly 2 decades worth of other killings that nobody had ever been able to close. Families came to his sentencing. A widow told the court her life ended in 1976 when her husband did. A son said the man who killed his father had never once apologized to any of the families. Judge Zagel gave him less than 12.5 years. A reporter in the room did the arithmetic out loud. Less than a year in prison for each person he admitted killing. That is the number, and it is grotesque, and the judge did not pretend otherwise. What he said was that leniency is sometimes necessary, that without it, nobody else ever comes forward, and the next case never gets made. Now here is the part of this that does not resolve, and I am not going to pretend it does. Everything you have just heard is one version, and it is the version that won in court. There is another one, and it comes from inside the same family. Frank Calabrese Jr. has a brother named Kurt. Kurt grew up in the same house, under the same father, in the same business. And Kurt has said publicly that as far as he is concerned, his brother is dead to him. What is interesting is what his objection is not. It is not that Frank Jr. cooperated. Kurt's quarrel is with the story, with the shape of it, with the version of their childhood and their father that got told to the world once his brother had a book and a reason to sell it. He has suggested the timing was not what people think, that the Noble account arrived later than the decision did, and that money troubles at home were closer to the real trigger than conscience was. He has also been bitter about their uncle, because notice who actually paid here. Nicholas Calabrese was the one who sat in the chair, named the men he had worked beside for 30 years, and took the sentence and the rest of his life looking over his shoulder. Frank Jr. got a book. And there is one line Kurt remembers from a family dinner from their father that is worth hearing whichever version you believe. My kids don't know anything that could hurt me. He was wrong about that, obviously, but he was not wrong the way you would expect. His children did not know his secrets. They knew him, how he talked, how he explained himself, what he sounded like when he was being reasonable about something terrible. That turned out to be the thing there was no defense against. 2 brothers, the same house, the same father, and 50 years later, they still cannot agree on what happened in it. This channel does not get to hand you a verdict on that one because the people who were actually in that house never reached one either. So here, finally, is the answer to the question we started with. The Chicago outfit was not brought down by the government outsmarting it. For 70 years, the government tried that and lost. It was brought down by 2 things it had no defense against, because both of them came from inside the family. The first was time. The outfit was built to defeat witnesses, and it was extremely good at that. Dozens of people watched a man die in a doorway, and not one of them could describe the shooter. What it was not built to defeat was a piece of cloth in a paper bag that simply waited, without fear, without loyalty, without anyone to intimidate until the science arrived. The second was a son who decided that the arrangement he had been born into was not going to continue through him. He asked for nothing, walked laps with his father in a prison yard wearing a recorder, and gave the government the voice of the man who raised him. Go back to the doorway of that bingo hall for a second. Nicholas Calabrese did everything right that night. by the standards of his world. He completed the job. He got out. He left behind a room full of people who would never say a word about him, and every one of them kept that promise for 20 years. The only thing in that building that talked was the glove. There is one man standing at the edge of all this who has never been the subject of a video on this channel. The son himself, Frank Calabrese Jr., and what happened to him afterward. He turned down witness protection. He published a book about his father, and when he tried to sit down in a store and sign copies of it, a message arrived that ended the tour. That story is still waiting.